Energy media readers, there's a topic, a story that I've been wanting to get to for the last 10 days, and that's the Prime Minister's April 17th announcement on the financial support package for the oil and gas industry. It's highly controversial, and there are a couple of things that haven't, a couple of aspects of it that haven't received the attention that I think they deserve. And to discuss that with me, I've got veteran energy journalist Shawn McCarthy from Ottawa on the line. So welcome to the interview, Shawn.
Thanks, Markham.
Now, what we saw on the 17th was the Prime Minister addressed the liquidity issue of oil and gas producers because their cash flow is dried up because of low prices. They're in deep trouble. But he said when he announced the expansion of the business credit availability, he said it was primarily targeted to medium-sized companies. And it said the same thing in the backgrounder. And that seemed odd to me that he would be that specific. And I think he was signaling that maybe the juniors aren't going to get the support that Calgary and Alberta are expecting. What's your take on that?
Well, from what I've seen, the credit goes from annualized 15 million to 60 million. So that covers a pretty broad range. I don't know, how many juniors are in position to need this. The big challenge, it seems to me, among a lot of challenges, there are a lot of big challenges, but among them would be that, when the oil price slumped, these guys, the banks got cold feet, and they're not extending lines of credit and so on. And so this was meant to carry people, over the course of a year or so, hopefully from that perspective when prices improve. But a lot of the juniors in particular, a lot of the really small guys are on the gas side, and we should talk about that, because that's a whole different situation than being exposed to WTI prices.
Yeah, I agree with you that that's an underreported story, because last year about this time, 9 gas producers sent a letter to Premier Jason Kenney, basically saying that if the government didn't intervene in some way, that as many as 13 producers could go bankrupt between, over the next 6 to 12 months. And I think that we're not talking about that, and we really should.
Yeah, I think that's a side of the industry that has not been as well covered, certainly in the mainstream media, as the oil side, and especially the big companies, the oil sand producers, but they've been in tough business for a long time here. Really since the gas shale revolution, and they're at the far end of a pipeline, very far from markets, and it's been very tough for them. There's the Marcellus, and their markets in central Canada and eastern United States they've had a real dogfight with producers from the Marcellus, who, every time the gas price shoots up a couple of cents per 1,000 cubic feet, there's that much more gas that is now in the money, and even there's a lot of wet gas there, meaning they can take the liquids out, make money on the liquids, and basically sell the dry gas at a loss. So very tough. I think there's some hope. There has been some hope that the LNG market would help to some degree. I think there's some competition there trying to make sure that the gas producers are in line as we move, Alberta moves and Saskatchewan off of coal for the power sector, that this would be a new market for them. But all those things are a few ways down the road here, and they've been in brutal shape for a couple of years now.
Yeah, and I think that is germane to my next point, which is that this additional business credit will be administered by the Business Development Bank and the Export Development Corporation, and both organizations have made it clear on their websites that their funding will only go to businesses that were viable prior to the pandemic collapse. And given the stress that these juniors have been under, I think there's a fairly good chance that many of them were not financially viable and were just being kept alive by their banks who didn't want to have to seize their assets and take on the environmental liabilities that come with them.
Right, right. Yeah, no doubt. And you know, I don't think, certainly the government is not looking to go back up the calendar and bail out an industry that was having trouble before we got into this is really a response to the current crisis where oil prices have collapsed and the industry is really facing what we think would be a relatively short-term sense of crisis. I think it could be a while before we get back to prices where they were, but at least, you know, not negative territory and moving back up rather than, you know, being in the basement for a long period of time. That's the hope, and we'll see.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So let's talk about the Orphan Well cleanup, and I was really surprised by the fact that it was actually fairly substantial. $1.7 billion is a lot of money, and I know it's partly meant to keep this, you know, put the service sector back to work, and it certainly will do that. But I wonder if, you know, maybe the government wasn't looking down the road and saying, you know what, we're going to give extra money because we think that some of these juniors are going to fail, and we may as well just admit it and fund their cleanup as well.
Well, that's it, right? I mean, if these companies are going to fail, that backlog and that liability is only going to grow. So I think everybody recognizes that. You know, one of the areas of criticism, and it is fair, I think, to make the point that it was not accompanied by any requirement for the industry to do anything in addition to, in terms of screening, or the provincial government in terms of screening the liabilities or trying to fix the situation. I guess the counter argument to that would be there's no money in the pot for anybody to fix it, and if you tried to force it, you'd just be driving more companies in the bankrupt. The moral hazard here is really huge. You know, if you say to a going firm that it has to devote more resources to the cleanup, that going firm may not be able to make it given the tight rope that everybody's walking here. And so, yeah, it's a bit of a mess, obviously. And I do think, to your point, I think the fact that this is seen as being very labor intensive, getting people back to work was a big part of it. They'd rather come in and support activity that will be clearly getting people back in the field and working, rather than giving it to companies that might use it to clean up their balance sheets a little bit, and who knows to what end, right? So I think that was, and it was also something that both the industry and the provincial government had been asking for.
I found it really interesting during his speech, the Prime Minister, and this is the April 17th announcement, he said that he had wrangled a commitment from the Alberta government to, you know, address this issue so there wouldn't be as many orphan wells down the road. But I find it equally interesting that in his comments, the Premier Kenney studiously avoided that. Yeah. And when he had made the announcement on Friday that the $1 billion, they were starting to roll it out, and he again studiously avoided that issue. So it is really contentious within the industry because it's exactly as you said, they've kicked this can down the road for decades, and now it's a crisis, and it doesn't matter what they do, it looks like they're going to wind up with failed companies and more orphan wells. So it truly is a mess.
Well, it's hard to come back after the fact and fix it, because these are companies that are, you know, financially distressed. Obviously, the thing you need to do is to make sure when you approve the activity that you have a good cushion to prevent it. You know, I think you could argue that the cushion was insufficient, because even at reasonable prices, the liability was growing, but nobody was anticipating, you know, the kind of market that we have now. And so I think you know, it's fair to say that even in this regard, even with the Orphan Wells, the increase in liabilities as a result of the pandemic are not something that should have been foreseen.
Here's another thing that hasn't received a lot of attention, Shawn. The $750 million, and it is repayable, but still, the government is providing it to fix the methane emissions leaks. And the underreported part of this story is just how leaky the Alberta system is. The Canadian Energy Research Institute did a study last year, and the Alberta industry was 11 times more leaky, or had a leak rate 11 times higher than British Columbia. Saskatchewan's even worse because it's got a fraction of the market, but produces almost 5 or 6 times higher than BC. So, and then on top of that, if that wasn't enough, the fact is that the measurement technology is still pretty primitive, and we can't really trust the data that we do have on methane emissions. So this is something I'm hoping that $750 million, A, reduces emissions, and B, really accelerates the industry's ability to measure what they are leaking.
Well, I mean, I did write a fair bit on this when I was writing for the Globe before I retired from there in August and last August. And a number of studies, academic studies, came out. Some of them funded by Environmental Defense in the U.S., but they have a very good reputation. Worked with the government of Colorado on methane control, and they're credible. And the studies all suggested that the problem was worse than industry was saying it was, and that the approaches that were being taken in terms of how you inspect things and was going to leave a problem in the field that we hadn't come to terms with, which was just what you're saying, was the poor measurement. So yeah, it's great that CIRI did the report, because in Calgary, CIRI has more credibility than a guy from Carleton University or somewhere, and I think the industry and the Alberta government has to take that more seriously. The upside of the methane issue is that, and again, everything's relative when you're facing existential crisis, because prices are down. Any cost is burdensome. I understand that. But still, the relative cost of emission reductions for methane is pretty low. And if you capture it, you get to sell the methane, if as long as there's a market for it. And, so it's not like taking emissions out of an emission stream and burying it, underground where nobody has use for it. There are economic incentives here for the industry to get its act together in terms of leaking. When do you ever want to leak your product? I guess when fixing the leak costs more than you can fetch for the cost of the product.
Shawn, thank you very much for this. I don't think we've heard the end of this story yet. I mean, there still are questions of maybe liquidity problems in the intermediates.
Oh, yeah,
and I know there's also been some chatter about what happens if this stretches on for a lengthy period of time, and the big guys have liquidity problems, because now you're not talking about hundreds of millions, you're talking about billions, and the problem gets that much bigger. So you and I'll have you back on, and we'll have another chance to discuss this in the near future, I'm sure.
Sounds good, Markham. Thanks.